Good morning and welcome to this week's Grow, where we gather to recharge, organize, and work here as members of MWEG. We are glad that you're joining us today as we have some women from American Promise joining us, as well as Jessica Larson and Erin Young from our Protect Democracy area of advocacy here at MWEG. We are going to be talking today about money and politics. The women from American Promise will talk to us why that's important and kind of the things that we can do to bring that to the attention of the American people and why we maybe want that on the ballot and why that's important. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the time over to Marie Henselder Kimmel and Vicki Barnes, and they can introduce themselves, and then Erin and Jessica can kind of talk with them about what MWEG's doing and why this is an important thing. So you guys can go ahead.
Hello, my name is Marie Henselder Kimmel. I've been a volunteer for American Promise since 2017 and the volunteer coordinator for the New Jersey State chapter. I'm a retired obstetrician gynecologist physician, and my concern about money and politics affecting women's health care led to my work with American Promise. Vicki, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Marie. Hi, everybody. My name is Vicki Barnes, and I started with American Promise in 2016, but I've been working on an amendment to the Constitution for over 10 years, ever since I found out that I would be a grandmother for the first time. I am determined to have my grandchildren inherit a functioning democracy. And I'm proud to say I'm the chapter leader of the great state of Minnesota.
We're really excited to have the opportunity to present our issue to you today in this Grow session with MWEG. You may have seen our American Promise table at MWEG's conference in Provo in this March, or at last year's conference we attended but did not have a table. And spoiler alert, at American Promise, we believe that excessive money in politics has seriously compromised our democratic little d system. And Rachel, could you share the slides for us?
It's coming.
Thank you. There's always a little delay with this technology. So let me introduce you to American Promise. We are a national, nonpartisan, nonprofit organized system of citizens advocates working to reduce the effect of wealthy donors having their way in our political system. Excuse me, hold on one second here. There we go. Okay. We are committed to restoring the power of the voices of the American people in our government for our freedom from the corrosive, overbearing power of big money in our system. We have a constitutional solution to correct this crisis that is gaining momentum. And I hope that after you hear this presentation, you'll be inspired to be part of our solution too. So it looks like we're having a little trouble getting the slides to come up.
Do you not see them?
I'm not.
Let me stop sharing and try again. Share my screen. How about now? Do you see that?
Perfect.
Okay.
So the plan to restore the people's voice in government and how you can be part of the constitutional solution. Next slide, please. Let's start off with a little survey. Is the American government run for the benefit of all of the people? A, yes, for benefit of all. B, I don't know, it depends. Or C, no, for the benefit of a few big interests. Think about that. And, since we don't have access to the whole audience, I'm just going to go ahead and have us move on to the next slide and show the results of 60 years, 60 years worth of polling that's been done on just this question. There's a project called the American National Election Studies Project that's been done, where a poll with many of the same questions is done every 4 years, every presidential year since the 1960s. On the left and on the lower part, the red shaded results show those who answered for the benefit of all. And the blue on the upper right represents those who answered no, just for a few big interests. In the 1950s, about 70% of Americans believed government was working for them and it was run for the benefit of all. Today, that number is 16% of Americans believe that the government works for them. That's atrocious in a democracy, and you can see it's not a new thing. It's been trending that low, below 25% since, basically 2008, but we had pretty big drops in the 1990s. There were big recession time and so on. So there are different factors that come in here, but many Americans, including if you answered for a few big interests, believe that the government is really not for the people anymore. Next slide, please. The American Promise, the name of our organization, is the promise that every American has a free speech right, a right to be heard, and a right to equal representation for all in our government. These are basic expectations we have as Americans. When as citizens, when we vote, we enter into a contract with the candidates that we elect. We want them to represent us in government, a contract that says, by electing you, we empower and entrust you to represent us as equal citizens and to protect our freedoms, including a right to free speech and an equal right to be heard, and to address issues with constructive problem solving. Next slide, please. But that contract is being violated by a system that favors wealthy special interests and corporations, dark money from outside our states, and even foreign money over the interests of ordinary American people. Over and over again, common sense solutions to pressing issues supported by the majority of Americans are thwarted by the financial power of big donors that buys them preferred status. Citizens become frustrated, skeptical, and are discouraged from voting when they don't feel that government works for them. Next slide, please. This one. So there are consequences when the will of the majority of Americans isn't heard and represented. There are many, many examples of how big money in politics hijacks our government and prevents Congress from addressing the needs, but there's a clear pattern for each one of these issues. A significant policy issue exists that government persistently fails to address, despite the fact that there's broad majority agreement across the political spectrum for a common sense solution. But somehow our voices are drowned out. Number two, a profitable industry or wealthy special interest group for the issue spends tremendous sums of money in elections and in lobbying to sway support in the political system to benefit their profits or interests. This effectively creates gridlock by creating a smokescreen of doubt, which blocks compromise and progress. And number three, the failure to address the issue has consequences. And unfortunately, excuse me, the price to be paid mostly falls on we, the everyday people. We're going to look at two issues today. Number one, unaffordable drug prices, and number two, climate change, to show how this pattern works. Next slide, please. Excuse me, I'll just take a sip. We all prioritize caring for the health and well-being of our families and ourselves. Have you or members of your family struggled to pay for medications prescribed for illnesses or ongoing health conditions? Like so many issues that are affected by the undue influence of money in our politics, 94% of Americans across the spectrum agree that prescription drug costs are outrageous in the United States and something needs to be done. Next slide, please. There truly is a US drug cost crisis. Here's three examples of the price we pay. We here in the United States pay the highest drug prices in the world by 2.5 times on average compared to other industrialized nations. The rate of increase of drug prices has exceeded inflation for the last decade, mostly due to repeated price hikes on existing drugs that have not seen price increases in foreign markets, the very same drugs by the very same companies. And yet polls show that 3 in 10 Americans, 30% of Americans, fail to take medications as prescribed due to cost. So they either never fill the prescription or they ration doses. This is shameful in the most wealthy nation in the world. Many Americans don't realize that most of the drugs on the market globally were developed here in the United States with American taxpayer funding for research in the drugs development by the National Institutes of Health. What happens is the drugs then go on to the private drug companies, they patent them, they further develop them, they market them, they sell them, they make the money. Yet, the pharmaceutical industry has had almost $2 trillion of net income in the last 20 years, with twice the profitability of the average S&P 500 large company on the stock exchange. The drug industry has built its excessive profits in part by ever higher drug prices. When we are paying more and US drug companies are raking in twice the profits than large American corporations, that seems like price gouging to me. How do they get away with it? Next slide, please. For the last 2 decades, efforts to rein in drug costs by Congress have been blocked by the pharmaceutical industry. The industry uses its financial clout to influence Congress and other federal agencies by campaign donations of $91 million over the last 10 years and lobbying spending of $1.5 billion over 10 years. And they are generally, Big Pharma is generally in the top few spots in amounts spent on lobbying, and they deployed 878 lobbyists last year. Remember, there are only 535 members of Congress between the House and the Senate. So almost 1.5 lobbyists per member of Congress. They're in business to make money, and they get huge returns on their political spending investment. These headlines illustrate how pharma targets candidates in elections who may help them by building opposition to the bills introduced to enact price reform, as they did in 2020 and in 2022. Dark money, millions of dark money spent in the 2020 election by the pharma lobby. Also, in 2022, there were millions spent in issue ads to convince voters, to oppose the politicians who were supporting the drug price reform efforts. Remember seeing those commercials that said, oh, if they rein in drug prices, we aren't going to have as many new drugs available. No, remember, we the taxpayers spend our taxpayers through the NIH to do most of that research or fund most of that research. So the new drugs still come out. There would have been maybe 10 drugs over the course of 10 years that may not have come to market as quickly with the price reforms. Big Pharma did succeed in watering down, remember the bill and it's now being talked about a lot, the Inflation Reduction Act. There's part of that bill that affected drug pricing. So the initial intention was 250 drugs were going to be negotiated for price, and the savings on those drugs were going to be extended to both Medicare and patients with private insurance. The way pharma money did succeed, the bill was passed, but they were able to reduce the number to 10, 250 down to 10 negotiated drugs each year. And it's only going to apply to prices for patients with Medicare, which is very important for our seniors, but the rest of the American public is also suffering with these drug prices. So yes, they had a small defeat on this being passed, but they won in terms of the scope of what was passed. So a major cause of Congress's dysfunction on drug prices, which we all pay, and many other issues that Americans care about and need action on, is the money that has its grip on our political system. Now Vicki is going to review money and politics aspects of climate change. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Marie. We all prize a beautiful, clean, healthy, stable environment that can sustain our peaceful lives. where we can breathe clean air and grow adequate food. A survey done by Pew in 2022 showed 71% of Americans experienced at least one form of extreme weather in their community. With the record-breaking weather events we have experienced in 2023 so far, it'll be interesting to see an update on those results. The effects of climate change have touched on overwhelmingly a majority of the United States and the world. These are the 2023 highlights of US extreme weather to date. July 2023, the hottest on the month globally in tracking of history for 174 years. Phoenix with that 31-day streak of over 110 degrees of heat waves and other heat waves. Devastating flash floods from record rainfall in California, Vermont, Pennsylvania. Extreme unhealthy air alerts from smoke from Canadian wildfires. Drought conditions in the Midwest, Central Texas, and the Pacific Northwest. And ocean water temperatures of 95 to 100 degrees in the Florida Keys. Next slide, please. Again, there is majority support for addressing the issue of climate change in an effective manner. The science of causation by human production of greenhouse gases has been settled for decades, but we'll review how public opinion and government action has been hijacked by the fossil fuel industries. In a poll done by Pew again in April 2023, 70% of all Americans support a plan for the United States to become carbon neutral by 2050, and 54% of Americans view climate change as a major threat. The CBS YouGov poll on the right was done in 2022. 2/3 of Americans said we must address climate change at least by the next few years, with 53% saying right now. And again, we know that although some steps have begun, the change has not yet stabilized and it's getting worse. Next slide, please. We all pay a price, both literally and figuratively, for the escalating changes in the climate. The economic costs. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Agency keeps track of the frequency of billion-dollar disasters, which in the 1980s averaged every 82 days. From 2017 to 2022, the United States averaged $1 billion disaster every 18 days, which resulted in disruption of daily local businesses by weather extremes, agriculture viability affected by the drastic climate changes, and insurers leaving high-risk states like California and Florida. The health costs with the heat is #1 climate cause of death, although the cold temperatures are what usually get the attention. Heat is #1 climate cause of death. Asthma, COPD, heart consequences, dementia risk is now being shown to be increased by pollution and smoke exposure. Most susceptible to health complications are children, pregnant women, elderly, outdoor workers, and the poor. The NIH study in 2022 showed children today are 35 times more likely to experience a climate disaster than in the 1960s. Pregnancy complications, including miscarriage and premature delivery, increase in heat stress. And those in poverty who can't afford air conditioning, don't have resources to afford their medical care, and as an ongoing challenge are especially challenged. Next slide, please. Of course, there are global costs to climate change as well. They include climate migration, which is the new term that used to be climate refugees. Climate migration, rising sea levels encroaching on island nations. Some of them are just about disappearing. Persistent drought leading to crop failure and famines, and all of the above contribute to political instability. We know that immigration and refugees are an important part of Mormon Women for Ethical Government mission. Migrants can be anywhere in the world, but the poorest and most vulnerable countries are disproportionately affected by the impact of climate change. These countries, ironically, contribute the least to the cause of this crisis. There are many villains when it comes to the effort in dealing with our planetary crisis, but it is again the money that is our biggest threat. Next slide, please. Let's take a look at the oil and gas industry incentives, their profits. In 2022, there were record oil and gas profits of $200 billion in the face of reduced supply due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The rate of profits continued in the first quarter of 2023. This follows decades of huge profits these multinational corporations get. And remember, annually, United States taxpayers still pay $20 billion in federal subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. An International Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, report from last year dealt with how to reduce the emissions that cause temperatures to rise. Rachel Cletus, policy director at the Union of Concerned Scientists, said in a statement following the release of the report, quote, decades of failure in global leadership combined with fossil fuel companies' single-minded focus on their profits and unsustainable patterns of consumption within the world's richest households are putting our planet at peril, unquote. Well, I couldn't have said it better myself. Next slide, please. It's not surprising that the fossil fuel industry is among the top political spenders in the United States. Just in the last 12 years, their political donations have totaled $659 million and $1.7 billion in lobbying of elected officials and federal agencies. The chart on the right details the biggest donor recipients from big oil in 2022. Both parties received donations, and those in positions of power on key committees and in key states are targeted. This money is truly an investment that yields great returns. Studies show an average of $200 return on every single dollar spent lobbying by winning relaxed regulations or tax breaks. And of course, influence to protect these global interests is easy to buy. It's hard to see this type of graph and not feel like our legislators are corrupt. It is actually the entire system that is corrupt. Next slide, please. Big spending in politics weaponizes the influence of wealthy donors. And here's how. With campaign contributions, they help elect sympathetic politicians. Outside spending, which is direct spending on ads and astroturf groups to create appearance of opposition or file lawsuits to object to laws and regulations. Lobbying, the influence of frequent meetings, bundling fundraising, pressure to support industry goals, and introduce legislation actually written by the lobbyists. When the wealthy can gain increased access and influence over everyday Americans to voice their concern, the needs of Americans have not gotten equal representation in our government. If we as Americans, we want to win progress on major issues that need solutions, we need to disable the power of money in politics by a small wealthy part of our nation to thwart the work to benefit us all. Next slide, please. Let's move on to look at how Americans assess our political system. A CBS News poll in September 2022 found that 72% of Americans believe our democracy is under threat. Next slide, please. That CBS YouGov study showed that both parties of Democrats and Republicans who believe democracy is under threat, 86 blame the influence of money in politics. Next slide, please. There's good reason to point to money in politics. The total cost of elections has been skyrocketing since 2010. In the 2016 presidential cycle, federal elections cost a record $6.5 billion. That was a record breaker. That more than doubled to $14.4 billion in 2020. Next slide, please. There's been rapid escalation in the cost to run for office in the decades since campaign finance rules were changed by an activist Supreme Court judges in 2010. The US House average cost of a winning campaign in 2008 was $1.3 million. In 2022 was $2.79 million. And the record breaker in that race was $28.4 million. In the US Senate, the average cost of winning the campaign in 2008 was $8.5 million. But in 2022, it was $26.5 million, with the record breaking race being $180 million. Keep in mind, the candidate with the most money wins 90% of the time. This presents a huge barrier to running for election for anyone without the money or connections to wealthy donors. But these numbers don't reflect all of the money spent, just the amounts directed by the candidates themselves. We'll talk about outside spending, which was unleashed by the Supreme Court in a minute. But next slide, please. When we saw details of the increasing cost of elections, candidates need to fundraise for their next campaigns immediately after winning their election. Once taking office in Congress, our representatives spend a big chunk of their day dialing for dollars. It's estimated they spend between 30 and 70% of their time raising money. This is a sample schedule for new members shown in a CBS News report. Call time is time spent in a party office with a phone and a call list, just like a telemarketer. It's time that they're not meeting with voters or working on legislation to meet the needs of all Americans. Of course, it's easy to understand how bigger donors may get more attention in this situation. During these fundraising calls, members of Congress are having conversations with wealthy donors, and often from outside of their district, because they're also raising money for the party. So during this fundraising time, our members of Congress are hearing concerns from wealthy donors rather than less wealthy constituents, which can influence decision-making. Now, Marie is going to tell us more about who donates all this money. Next slide, please.
So who donates all of this money to political campaigns? Our elections are overwhelmingly dependent on money from a wealthy donor class, which on the left, the pie chart represents the less than 1% of Americans who make political donations of more than $200. Because with the cost of living, obviously, most people don't have the money to donate. So that slim sliver of the population, then on the right, the money that they donate actually represents 75% of all the individual donations made in political campaigns. So the other thing to know is that a significant number of those big donors are really big, mega donors, who give millions of dollars to super PACs and dark money groups as well. So this very, very slim part of our population is really having outsized influence. Next slide, please. There's a lot more money going into our elections, and more of it is dark money. I think of dark money as behind a curtain, money spent by secretive groups that legally don't disclose their donors. They usually have some very American sounding name, like I'm trying to think of one that's not a real one. Americans for Apple Pie, okay? Anybody could be behind that, must be good. They use their outside spending directly on ads that they buy themselves. And they also fund AstroTurf or false activist groups to make announcements and appear at candidates' offices to make statements outside of candidates' campaign, and supposedly without coordination with the candidates. To be legal, that's what they're supposed to do, although they have ways around that. From the time of two key court decisions allowing unlimited money and contributions by corporate groups to super PACs, there was a total of $1 billion of this dark money spent in 10 years, from 2010 to 2020. But the 2020 election, in one campaign cycle, surpassed $1 billion in that one campaign cycle. I had the, as you know, Vicki and I told you, we started working in this field in 2016, 2017. I'm getting chills now, even saying $1 billion in one election of, we don't know where the money came from. Just a lot of money flooded in. Both political parties have benefited from dark money. These are the top spending dark money groups from the 2020 election, when dark money spending that year went mostly to the benefit of Democrats. From 2010 to 2018, the Republicans dominated the dark money spending. 2018 was the first time Democrats and Republicans equalized. 2020, the Democrats outspent the Republicans, and 2022, the spending was pretty much equal again in terms of dark money. So it's a money arms race. Next slide, please. Another feature of our broken system is the increasing influence from out-of-state donors. We each come from a state. There are elections in our state. We want to elect our local governments and our state governments and our congressional representatives to represent our values and our needs. But donors from any state can spend across state lines to affect elections that may have the effect on the overall balance of power in Congress, or to elect candidates more favorable to the special interests of the donor group. Here's a quote regarding the 2020 re-election campaign of Senator Susan Collins by David Trahan, who's a former Republican state senator from Maine. The outside spending of out-of-state and actually out-of-country foreign money in that Maine election bought up all of the ad space that blocked Maine groups and citizens from political advertising in their own state's election. There was Canadian oil money that was spent in Maine because there was a little American interest. It was legal for them to put money into the groups there and to do the buying. They were trying to influence pipeline decisions that were being made in Maine. The former state senator said we were under 20 feet of snow in an avalanche and no one could hear us. Next slide, please. So how did we get here? 40 years of Supreme Court decisions. And I just want to point out this political cartoon is one of my favorites. As you can see, the fat cat in the suit has his 1% mark on his suit jacket there. And he says, "Thanks again to the Supreme Court, my free speech is worth more than yours." And he has his rolled up campaign contributions blowing away the little guy, the 99%. 100 years ago, as a result of corruption in the Gilded Age, our foundational campaign finance laws, federal laws, were enacted to restrict corporate money from being spent in politics and to overcome the dominance of the industry titans. Remember, they were called robber barons over politics. Sounds exactly like the situation we have again now. But in the last 40 years, a series of Supreme Court decisions led to a ruling that political spending by corporations and legal entities is quote unquote speech, money equals speech. And that because freedom of speech is protected by the First Amendment, then Congress and state legislatures can't place limits on the raising of spending of money to influence elections. Federal campaign finance laws and 24 states' laws were overturned by those Supreme Court decisions. These decisions led to the creation of super PACs and independent expenditure nonprofits that can raise and spend unlimited amounts of money as long as that spending is independent of campaigns and not coordinated with the candidates. That's what I was telling you about in terms of the outside spending. And there are some of those entities that have to disclose who the donors are. That's super PACs, but the others, the independent expenditure nonprofits, don't have to disclose who their donors are. So those are the dark money groups. But unfortunately, the dark money groups can donate to the super PACs and say, "Hey, I'm dark money group. That's all you can know about me." So it's really a rigged system. The court is protecting the wrong people. It's not the wealthy special interests who need to have their speech protected. It's you and me, so we can be heard. Next slide, please.
Does the Supreme Court have ultimate rule in the United States? Fortunately, no. The people and our Constitution do. The Constitution is the law of the land. So why do we at American Promise think that we need a constitutional amendment to fix this? First of all, it's not possible for Congress to overrule a Supreme Court ruling with legislation. Supreme Court rulings can only be overturned in two ways. One, if the court overturns itself, which isn't likely anytime in the near future, or second is to be overturned by a new constitutional amendment. A constitutional amendment makes the correction permanent. It can't be overturned if there's a change in lawmakers in Washington and Congress. Number three, there's precedence. We, the people, can amend the Constitution to correct the Supreme Court. And we've done that 8 times already in our 27 constitutional amendments. And we've got to do it again now. A constitutional amendment respects the principle of federalism by allowing each state, once the constitutional amendment is passed, then each state can create its own rules that's best for its elections. Campaign finance laws, as I said before, of 24 states were struck down by the Supreme Court rulings that changed all of this. And last of all, Americans are united. There's consensus that we need this amendment. Next slide, please. This crisis of money in politics isn't a reason for despair. It's a call to citizenship. It's a call to action in this time of political turmoil. Our constitutional solution is the 4R Freedom Amendment, which will protect our freedom to have our voices heard without the capture of political discourse by big money, and restore our power to participate as equal citizens in our representative government by restoring the power of Americans to regulate election money. Next slide, please. The language in the amendment, these are the 3 parts of the amendment. The language in the amendment was developed after American Promise held a series of, I think, almost 2 years of conferences and discussions with various people from, within politics, from political science, from both sides of the aisle, and to come up with language that would address what needs to be done, and also to be acceptable to both liberal and conservative political thought processes. So the key points of the 4R Freedom Amendment would bolster our sovereign interests in representative self-government, in federalism, and in the integrity of the electoral process and political quality of all citizens, by enabling Congress and the states to set reasonable limits on political contributions and spending, and by distinguishing the rights of legal entities like corporations, unions, super PACs from the rights of natural persons like you and me. Next slide, please. So Vicki, how do you amend the US Constitution?
Thank you
Next
for
slide.
asking, Marie. In short, people power. The amendment is how you amend the United States Constitution, people power. As Marie said, we've done that 8 times before, and it's time to do it again. The amendment will end unlimited, concentrated, and unaccountable money in our political system in order to secure equal rights, true representation, and more functional government for generations to come. We're building a nationwide cross-partisan network of Americans to work to target of ratifying an amendment by July 4th, 2026 for the 250th anniversary of our founding. And there are 2 paths to amend the Constitution detailed in Article 5 of the Constitution. The process that all amendments have followed so far requires passage of the amendment proposal by 2/3 votes of both the House and the Senate. And then the proposal is sent to the state legislators to ratify. We need 3/4 of the states, or right now that's 38, to ratify the amendment, which our plan facilitates by the ready to ratify work that we're continuing. Next slide, please.
We're a little
Oh,
behind.
we're 1
This is the
behind,
that-
okay.
We'll go.
So,
One more.
and you'll see from this slide though, that we have 2/3 of the House is 290, and we got up to 220 last session, and 2/3 of the Senate is 67, and we got up to 50. And currently, next slide, please. Oh, you'll see at the next slide that we are at 22 states. So people often react to the idea of a new amendment with skepticism. Good luck with that. But the founders included the process of amending the Constitution as a means for the people to correct our system. In our history, at times of high political turmoil, Americans have successfully used the amendment process. We've had the time of the founding with the Bill of Rights. They had to get in there and fix things that weren't working quite correctly. Then after the deep divisions over slavery and pitted the North and South against each other, the civil rights amendments were passed in that period. And the Gilded Age, as Marie mentioned earlier, with the robber barons, the divisions of the industrial tycoons against the working people gave us the progressive era, where we ended up passed amendments for popular election of the senators, and civil rights, federal income tax, and women's suffrage. And the last cluster of amendments was in the civil rights era. We're certainly in one of those high times of political turmoil and division right now, which calls for constitutional correction. And as you can see, when we are in such bad situation as a country, when our democracy faces its biggest challenge, we corrected it with more than one amendment. So we're just talking about the one for campaign finance. Think about what other amendments you might want to throw in there, because you will probably get 3 or 4 more. Next slide, please. This is Jeff Clements, the president of American Promise. And he said, I quote, "Constitutional amendments are the story of America. With them, we have resolved and won the most epic struggles and fulfilled the best aspirations of the nation," unquote. It's safe to say we have more work to do to improve our nation and to get ever closer to perfecting our union. Next slide, please. We are optimistic that this amendment can succeed because we have the support of the American people across the political spectrum. This amendment is supported by 75% of Americans. That's 66% of Republicans, 85% of Democrats, and 70% of independents. No other amendment work has started with this much broad support among the electorate. Next slide, please. So American Promise has a strategic plan to win the For Our Freedom Amendment. We've been building national, cross-partisan leadership in our movement with a message that resonates with both sides of the political aisle. We continue to build state-based, ready to ratify campaigns to spread the word in states and gain support from the state legislature via citizen ballot initiatives or non-binding resolutions. 22 states have signed so far, with several in the process currently. Building that state-based support helps to recruit supporters in Congress for passage. And finally, the state-based support simplifies the work of getting the 3/4 of the states needed to ratify the amendment. With 22 states already on board, we're over halfway to the 38 required for ratification. And as you can see, our timeline is targeting our 250th anniversary in 2026 for ratification of the For Our Freedom Movement. And let me just throw in here that I know it doesn't look very hopeful right now, but when we have the series of amendments that happen through those eras that we talked about, there comes a tipping point. We don't know what it is yet. It may be huge, it may be small. I mean, the January 6th thing didn't do it, so we don't know what's going to do, but something will happen that will spur this amendment into the public awareness and will greatly increase our ability to get it passed. So just don't be discouraged. There will be a tipping point. History tells us that. Now, Marie will explain our advocacy and wrap up our presentation.
And the next slide, please. So the simple and most basic fact is that if we, the American people, want better representation of the will of the people, we have to exercise our right to speak out, to make our will known. and to build the political will to make changes. We have to take on responsibilities of citizenship to make this happen so we can have a better system. MWEG uses the same advocacy model that we use with American Promise. We use community outreach to spread the word and education and build support by community meetings, talking with friends, talking with relatives, by writing letters to the editor and op-eds. We gather citizen signatures in support of the amendment, all to spread the word. We also reach out to talk to our elected officials with meetings, gaining support with candidate pledges and election years, and next year will be a big one. And working with local governments to pass resolutions to call for Congress to pass the amendment resolution. We bring all the local support to meetings with our congressional members to ask for their support for the amendment proposal to advance in Congress. Next slide, please. Here are 3 sources for you to further research money in politics and its effects: opensecrets.org, unitedforthepeople.org, and americanpromise.net, which is our website. Open Secrets, as it's listed, it's a nonpartisan independent research group tracking money in politics and its effects. And on there, we're going to show a slide with their website in a second. You can track what donation levels there are for federal candidates and federal elections. You can look at how many of those are from small donors, versus large donors, how several different candidates in a particular congressional race are faring against each other in terms of donations. You can look at industry donors and lobbying profiles and issue profiles. As you can see, when we go to the page, they have one of the issue profiles that they did most recently is listed at the top of the page there. Then unitedforthepeople.org is a database to track the congressional amendments to reduce the effect of money in politics, as well as state-based resolutions for the amendment and which of the congressional members have supported the amendment. This is a kind of interesting history. So if you're trying to find out, well, what's happening in my state and have there been local resolutions passed and so on, United for the People is one where you can find that. And I just want to say that since these decisions were handed down in 2010, immediately there was an amendment resolution in Congress that year. Unfortunately, it only had two co-sponsors. So when Vicki mentioned that last year we were up to 220 co-sponsors in the House and 50 in the Senate, there's been a lot of progress made in the last decade plus 12 years. And then on AmericanPromise.net, you can see obviously information about our work, but also we have that candidate pledge program. You can see previous candidate pledge signers under the Our Progress tab. And then we'll be rolling out the whole program to obtain pledge signers for the upcoming 2024 elections. So that's going to be a big push. And next slide, please. This is the Open Secrets website. And as you can see, they've got current articles on money in politics. They're cited very frequently in mainstream media posts about elections and money in politics, as well as the listing you can see across the middle of the page there, the databases to look about candidate campaigns, elections, industry and interest groups, as well as lobbying data. And at the very top, it might be hard to read, but their latest issue profile was a look at the gun lobby spending. Of course, with all of the, unfortunately, with our mass shooting epidemic, as you know, there's a lot of money by gun lobby. There's money spent, obviously, by groups in support of moving to, control gun violence, but they don't have the funding that the gun lobby has. So that's an interesting issue profile to look at. And opensecrets.org is their website. Next slide, please. This one's a little hard to read. I apologize, but it's the United for the People website, which again shows what's happened in your state up to now. And you can see what decisions and what amendment resolutions have been done in your state. Next slide, please. So why are we doing this? What are we trying to achieve with this amendment? It's going to set up a situation where regulations, laws can be made by the states and by Congress to allow a systemic, deep, and lasting improvement to our constitutional republic. We want to shift voting power to the citizens and small dollar donors, not that very, very slim portion of the electorate that has all the money to donate. We want our elected representatives and candidates and policies to better resolve the health, environment, economy issues that we all face rather than serving the narrow interests of the big donors. We want a level playing fields in elections to reduce money as a barrier so we can have a wider range of candidates, a wider range of choices, and a wider range of ideas. We want greater incentives for candidates and representatives to deliver solutions and to be accountable to constituents, because that's what we should have in a vibrant democracy. And we want liberty and justice afforded to all natural persons equally. It shouldn't matter what your bank account number is and how much you can afford to donate to try to get influence. Next slide, please. We can ensure freedom, equal representation, and the promise of our great American democracy for generations to come. Specific issues need focused action, and we need to correct the undue power of money in our political system to level the playing field so we can make serious progress in each of the individual policy areas that we all work on. It's within your power to transform the course of American history. If you agree that the voices of all Americans need to be top priority in our government for our equal representation and for our freedom, we encourage and welcome you to add your voice to ours to win this amendment. Scan the QR code on the right to sign our citizen pledge to support the effort to win the amendment for our freedom. That won't put you on a mail list or anything like that. That just puts your name in the database so that when we send information to your congressional representatives or your senators, we have your name as, hey, this is another one of your constituents who supports that you support this amendment. Thank you for your attention, and we welcome your questions.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Marie.
Go ahead, Jessica.
I was going to say thanks, Marie and Vicki. I had one question. Does American Promise have, I'm thinking about our members in different states in a way that they can connect with you directly. Do you guys have, representation in each state that they could connect with? How does that really work?
So the best way to do that is then if you go onto our website, and you would be directed there by the citizen, if you go to that citizen pledge and do that, then there is a place where you can check off that you're interested in volunteering. And that puts you into connection with our Vice President of Advocacy, Mike Mineta, and then he sends people who say, you know, I want to get involved, I want to find out what's going on in my state. Then he directs people then to whichever one of the state leaders are working, you know, in that area.
Great,
and we do
thank
have
you.
some, just like MWEG has, we have some national groups that meet online. Like I lead the writing and media action team. So if somebody's really interested in that, then they can, you know, attend virtually and you know, get things published in their particular area. And then we try to say, okay, well, great, you got something published. Let's get it sent to your congressman. Let's get it sent to your you know, town council. Let's get it sent to your city commissioner, to your state legislature, and parlay that achievement into more effect.
Great. Yeah, great. That's right. And that's similar to what we do here at MWEG. So I know our members are very interested in that. Erin, did you have any questions? Erin's kind of our expert on money and politics at MWEG, and she's been working for a couple of years on educational series that's going to be coming out soon. So
great.
She may have more to say.
No, just one question that I do have with the candidate pledge program is what candidates is that targeted at? Is that at the state and federal level, or is that specifically at the state so that the states then call on Congress to pass an amendment?
It's both. You state, local, even churches can pass it, you know, and anybody can pass a resolution calling on Congress to act. So yes, we have it. We have both, cities, counties, state, and other institutions.
Okay.
We kind of leave it up to, and I think again, this very much mirrors how MWEG works. We leave it up to the local chapter to decide who they want to target. So in a particular state, like I'm going to say in New Jersey actually passed a non-binding resolution calling for the amendment back in 2012. So we as a state chapter have decided we have mostly focused on federal candidates up to now, but we're in this ready to ratify. We're going to continue working on the state candidates. We're starting to work downstream a little bit more to the state legislature and see how much we can get the state candidates to sign on, because hopefully, if we can meet our timeline within a couple of years, what happens in politics, the people who run for state office, then some of them eventually run for federal office. So, if we can get their support now, they'll still be in state legislature and they'll be ready to ratify there, or maybe by the time it comes actually up in Congress, that's where they'll be voting for it. But the more that the information and the support is throughout the system, the better it is in terms of passing a constitutional amendment.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And the same with school, if you're running for school board. School boards, we have all seen those have been in the news a lot, influenced by outside money coming in and pushing an agenda. So they may be in the state legislature when it comes time to ratify. So there's no position that's not worth trying.
So American Promise has the For Freedom Amendment with that specific text. And I know I've seen other constitutional amendments proposed with different texts, but that pretty much are targeting the same goals. I'm just curious as to if American Promise would support some of those other amendments. Like, what are the non-negotiables in terms of what's included in the amendment, and what are maybe some other things like, the specific language may be flexible?
Yeah, they're actually in Minnesota, the state legislature, they're at a session right now, but next year they're supposed to be passing a resolution calling on Congress to act, but it's much more broad resolution. It deals with corporations aren't people, money's not speech, it requires transparency, and those three statements outright is something that American Promise does not use, because we're cross-partisan, and that will turn off more conservative people. However, if it's passed that way, we count that as a state. I mean, the 22 states, about half of them are just like ours, generic, non-offensive. I mean, what I like the best about the For Freedom Amendment, it doesn't go head to head with the First Amendment. It doesn't say something so big as, money's not speech. We don't want that challenge. And we've done a lot of research with coming up with that verbiage. But half of them have passed the big broad one, and half of them have passed the more, the more concise one. And also, just for, half of them were passed through ballot initiatives, and half were passed through state legislatures, because not all states have ballot initiative capability. So yeah, we're not stuck with it. We just want to get there.
What I love about American Promise is that, first of all, there are many groups working on money in politics, and all of their work is very important, but a lot of them are very much leaning to one side of the political spectrum or the other. And so I have to say that the amendment resolutions that have made the most progress have been the ones up to now, because remember I said, Republicans are the ones that dominated this money in politics issue with the dark money and so on and so forth until 2018. So the Democrats were the ones in Congress who were mostly supporting the amendment resolutions. And in fact, the 2018 amendment resolution because unfortunately I've gone through enough congressional sessions now where I remember this history. There were 222 Republicans were on it. And actually, I think we got, was that the one where we got to 3, Vicky? When I was actually a New Jersey congressman who flipped from Democrat to Republican. He had co-sponsored before he flipped.
Yep.
So I think he made a third, but then
Yeah.
unfortunately, so, and the other Republican, so he flipped to Republican, he has not co-sponsored. And the other Republican was John Katko from New York, who was one of the moderate Republicans who decided to retire. I don't think he was primaried out. I think he decided to retire in the 2022 elections.
Yeah.
So we right now are not talking about any particular resolutions that are in Congress. We've developed this language over the last, I think, about 3 years. And what we really want to do now is the strategy is to have Republicans introduce this language, because we get a lot of support. We've been hearing from Republican congressmen for years, back to 2017. I really like this language. I hate fundraising, but I can't stick my neck out. The party won't go for it. So now we have something where the people supported all of these things. The people support this. I had a lot of success here in New Jersey in 2022, getting Republican candidates to sign on. Unfortunately, none of them won their primaries, but at least they were signing on saying, yeah, we need to get this resolution done. So now if we can get Republican congressmen to introduce the language, we want it to kind of grow in the Republican Party and overcome some of the partisanship sort of in a sneaky way, in a way, like get the Republicans all to sign on, get them to think this is a Republican bill. And then when the Democrats sign on, because it says the same thing as the amendment resolutions they've been supporting for years, except it gets around the money is speech, then we have that bipartisan support. So
Yeah,
it's
that makes sense.
yeah.
Explaining that.
So that's
so we
a long-winded answer, but it really explains what the strategy is and what the history is too.
Work right to left. And that's, and when, you're out in the field, county fairs and that kind of thing in more conservative areas, it's overwhelmingly conservative support there. So the people are very much for this. And as far as the amendment language, this is what we've come up with as a group through our research. But Congress ultimately will be the one to write the amendment. So this should be generally what it says. But the final version is going to come from Congress.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much. This has been such a great presentation.
Thank you for having us.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm just checking to see if there's any other questions from those who are joining us that haven't shown their faces yet today. I don't see any questions from the chat in our Facebook Live group, but thank you to Vicky and to Marie for being with us today and for supporting MWEG. And also we're grateful for the work that you guys are doing with American Promise and for democracy. And I will put links in the Facebook discussion group to some of the sites that they cited in their presentation today. And they will send us a copy of the presentation slides. If you are interested to have those, I can post those as well. We are grateful for those who joined us and the work that they're doing. And we hope that you'll join our Grow next time. So for that, we'll say goodbye.